Today I'm going to share with you 5 of the most common mistakes we see rookie Northern Lights photographers make and teach you how to avoid those. Whether you've never pressed the shutter underneath a sky filled with aurora, or you've done it 1,000 times, I'm hoping that I can teach you at least 1 or 2 tips to help you make better aurora photos. So grab your pencil and notepad, and let's get started. I've been shooting the Northern Lights for 13 years, and in that time I've spent thousands of hours out underneath the aurora. And I've made just about every mistake that you can imagine. So today, I hope to help teach you some of those mistakes and help you avoid them. If you've done night sky photography, this might seem obvious, but for those of you who haven't, a tripod is an absolute must. A good solid ball head tripod is always preferable. It gives you a lot of leeway, and it's easier to adjust in the dark where you can't see things very well. If you're off level, really helps make things easy. Check out our video about what gear you need to photograph the Northern Lights for more details on the tripods that we recommend. Another thing that's critically important is to either use the self-timer or a shutter release. There's a variety of different types of shutter releases you can get, from ones like this that plug into your camera, or the wireless kind. Both types work really well, and I'll link to them in the description below. Another thing that may not be so obvious is that you want to turn steady shot, image stabilization, vibration reduction, IBIS, whatever your manufacturer calls it, make sure that's turned off. Because what happens is the camera is trying to stabilize the image, and when you're doing a long exposure, if the camera thinks for whatever reason that it's detecting a little bit of motion, it will actually start to move around your sensor or lens elements or a combination of those, and it will blur your shots rather than help them. So if you're on a tripod, go ahead and turn it off. If you're handheld, it's really helpful, but for night shots, we turn that off. Next thing you want to take into consideration for night photography is that you're not going to be able to autofocus. If you've never tried that, go out in the dark and try your autofocus sometime. It usually doesn't work very well, especially for what we're focusing on, which is the stars in the sky. So what you want to do is pop your camera into manual focus mode. Once you're in manual focus mode, you want to use your magnifier to zoom in on a star or some light source way off in the distance, at least 10 meters or further away. And then once it's magnified, you want to rack that focus ring back and forth ever so slightly until that object becomes nice and tack sharp. Once it's sharp, you're in focus. If you're on a mirrorless camera, you want to make a note of where that focal mark is, because you're going to want to duplicate that. Mirrorless cameras, if you pull the battery out, if you have to do a battery swap, that focus point resets itself. And so you're going to need to remember where that spot was. So I just make a mental note of that. If you're shooting a DSLR, it's a little bit easier because you've got the focal marks on your lens and it will stay there even if you turn the camera off. And some lenses, Canon L glass in particular, is great because it's what we call parafocal, meaning that as you zoom in and out throughout the focal range on, like, say, the 16 to 35, it will maintain that focus point throughout that focal distance. So if I'm at 16 millimeters when I set my focus, I can zoom in all the way to 35 millimeters and that focus point will maintain where it should be. On most other lenses, that is not the case. They are not parafocals. So Sony lenses, the Nikon 14 to 24, for example, and many others are not parafocals. So if you're using a wide angle zoom and you do change your focal length, you're going to need to change your focus point. So get really good and practiced at doing that manual focus maneuver at night, because it's going to come in really handy if you're having to change that focal length. If you do have one of the parafocal lenses, then what we like to do is take a piece of gaff tape and tape the focus ring in place. If you're shooting a mirrorless or a Nikon or something like that that's not parafocal, then don't tape it down. If you have not taped it down and you don't have one of those parafocal lenses, be sure to periodically magnify in on your images and check your stars and make sure they're sharp. The telltale sign of a new night sky photographer is out of focus stars, so make sure that doesn't happen to you. Don't forget about good composition. That sounds obvious, but it's not. A lot of folks come out and they photograph the aurora for the first time, and maybe we get a nice corona, which is an aurora that rains down on us from directly overhead. And when it happens, a lot of people tend to just point their cameras straight up and they take pictures of that corona. And it's beautiful colors in the sky, but quite honestly, it's a bit boring because there's not anything to anchor that shot and give us a sense of perspective. Think of your aurora photography as landscape photography with sky and aurora in it, rather than just aurora photography, and you'll get much better shots. And just like with landscape photography, generally not a good idea to put your horizon line right across the middle of the frame. You typically want this on 1/3 or the other third. And speaking of, use the rule of thirds in your composition. I'm going to show you a few examples here, so have a look at these and take this as a guideline. Most modern cameras have a rule of thirds guides either through the EVF or on the back display, so use that to your advantage and make sure that you're setting up your composition using that rule of thirds. Another compositional tool I like to use and actually prefer over the rule of thirds is the golden ratio. And that's because in nature, the golden ratio appears repeated throughout everything we see in nature. It's very prevalent. And so by composing with the golden ratio in nature photos, I personally feel that it gives a more natural look and a more pleasing look. So you can use that as well. It's close to the rule of thirds, but it's a little bit off. That one there isn't a guide for typically in most cameras, and so what you want to do is kind of use maybe Lightroom with a golden ratio overlay and kind of crop your photos and adjust and play with it and kind of get that stuck in your head so that when you're out shooting, you see that composition naturally. Also, place your main dominant subjects on those intersecting lines where the rule of thirds kind of cross over each other. That's always a great idea. Here's a good example of that. And then finally, don't forget that you can turn that camera and shoot vertical. And in fact, a lot of times with the Aurora, you should. What I like to do is let the Aurora dictate that for me. If it's kind of low and going across the horizon, then I tend to shoot horizontal. If it's going up overhead and I can make a better composition with more Aurora, I'll turn the camera and then I can get a little bit of the foreground and the bottom and still feature the Aurora very prominent, just like this. Another common mistake that we see is people using filters for Aurora photography, and that is a big mistake because some filters, even UV filters, can create what we call Newton's rings. Newton's rings occur when you have a flat piece of glass over a curved piece of glass and you get reflections between the two elements, and it causes images that look like this. They're way beyond my technical abilities to remove in Photoshop, and so it's just better to avoid them. Not all filters will cause this, but plenty do, and particularly with the Aurora, it's an issue. So if you're shooting Aurora or just night sky images in general, for me personally, I just remove all filters. There's no reason to use them, and so I take them off. Another setting that we see overlooked all too often, but that you don't want to miss, is long exposure noise reduction. Long exposure noise reduction is a really useful feature to have in some cases, but it's not helpful for Northern Lights photography. So a place where I might use that is, say I'm in Death Valley in the middle of July, where it's maybe 90 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and I'm photographing the Milky Way doing long exposures. During that time, what happens is my camera sensor gets extremely hot and it starts to produce hot pixels or long exposure noise. If I turn long exposure noise reduction on, the camera will solve that issue for me. But how it does it is the issue for us with Northern Lights photography. So let's say I'm doing a 20-second exposure of the Milky Way, and I have that setting turned on. The camera is going to take my shot just as I asked it for 20 seconds. Then it's going to close the camera's shutter curtain, and it's going to take another photo, but it's going to be a black photo of the back of the shutter. That's going to allow it to find all of those little hot pixels and then remove them from the original image. But it has to duplicate that shutter time. So your 20-second exposure becomes a 40-second exposure and then a little bit of time for processing. It's a brilliant setting and it's going to save you a lot of work in post-production, but it's not useful for Northern Lights photography. And the reason for that is most of the time we're photographing Northern Lights, we're in a cold enough environment that we don't typically see those hot pixels. And so what you're really doing is just eliminating half the shots that you could be taking. So if the Aurora only lasts for, say, 2 minutes, you're only getting half the shots by having that setting on. So by turning it off, you can get twice as many shots and capture every moment of that fast-moving Aurora. Now I should mention, some manufacturers do call this slow shutter noise reduction. There's a couple of other different names for it, but look it up in your manufacturer's manual. And not all cameras separate this function from high ISO noise reduction. So when you're looking at your noise reduction settings, you're looking for one of two. There should be long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction. They are separate things. And so if your camera only shows noise reduction, go ahead and leave it turned on, especially if you're shooting JPEG, because that will also clean up the high ISO noise. Now guys, this is by no means intended to be a fully exhaustive course on Northern Lights photography, but if you would like to learn more and you'd like to get in deep with this and you'd like to learn step by step how to set up your particular camera and lens, we are now offering online photography workshops to help you set up your gear. We will be doing those every Saturday, and you can find a link to those in the description below. Or, even better, if you're able to come up to Fairbanks this spring or next fall or sometime in the future, hop on up and join us for a tour and we'll guide you in person step by step. But if you don't happen to be able to do that and you still want to try your hand at this and you want to learn, sign up for one of our online courses and we'll walk you through your particular setup and help you get ready to photograph Northern Lights. Did you guys learn anything? Any of you veterans learn anything new? How about you beginners? Did we teach you a couple of tricks to get you started? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have something to add to any of that, let us know that as well. We're always interested to see what you guys have to say. If you learned anything new, guys, do hit that like button. It really does help us out with this YouTube algorithm. And like I always mention in every video, that helps us be able to keep creating this kind of content. So hit that like button, leave a comment, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. That kind of stuff really does help us out, and we really appreciate it. Sincerely. We post a new video each week. Sometimes it's about how the Northern Lights work, sometimes it's beautiful footage of the aurora, and sometimes it's tips and tricks or camera reviews or things like that. So there's always something new to check out every week. And on that topic, next week, I'm going to be talking about proper etiquette when viewing the aurora and when photographing it. Unfortunately, that is something that is not taught to a lot of folks, and it's something that you probably should know when you're going out there, how to behave responsibly and not interfere with other people's enjoyment and photography of the Northern Lights. So we'll cover that in detail next week. All right, guys, that's going to do it for me today. Thanks so much, and we'll see you guys in the next video.